This episode is brought to you by Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. Choiceology is a show about the psychology and economics behind the decisions we make every day and how to make better ones. I'm Dr. Katie Milkman. Join me as I share true stories from Nobel laureates, athletes, authors, and everyday people faced with monumental decisions. We'll share useful tools and strategies to help you make better decisions in your own life. You can find Choiceology at schwab.com/podcast or wherever you listen.
I think my biggest anxiety about taking a gap year was sort of just like, would it be a good use of my year? Would I feel like bored to no end, or would I get as much out of it as I would from a year of college?
Welcome to How To. I'm Carvell Wallace. When I was about 21 years old and in college, I went overseas to work for a theater company in the summer. And when I got back to New York in the fall, it was time to register for classes in my senior year. But I just didn't. It wasn't like I had a plan. I just kind of sat in my apartment as the deadline for registration came and went. I ended up spending a year working 2 jobs, one as a bike messenger, one as a fundraiser for a social justice organization, and just eked out a living in New York. It was a wild time, weird and exhausting. I had bike accidents, I got hit by taxis, I showed up to work at 6 a.m., I worked 14-hour days sometimes. When it was all over, there was really one main thing I had learned. Life out here is hard. I learned that work is real, and college was actually a privilege and an opportunity. And if I didn't want to spend the rest of my life bleeding on the pavement in Midtown Manhattan, I'd better take advantage of my education. But it's also hard to know that sometimes until you go through it. And that was me at age 21. So why do we ask 18-year-olds to know what they want to do with their life when the whole thing about being 18 is that you have no idea what you're doing? That's where gap years come in. Even though we're taught to go to college as soon as possible, there is a growing understanding that taking some time to experience the world outside of school can make you a better student and a better person. But how do you know if a gap year is right for you? And if it is, what do you do with it? And if it isn't, how do you make sure that you get the most out of your time in school? These are all questions our listener this week is facing.
I'm Leo. I'm a high school student considering a gap year.
Awesome. What makes you consider it? What aren't you sure about?
For me, the main reason I'd like to do a gap year is I'd like to sort of get out of the school system for a little bit before I go back into it, sort of do something radically different from how I've spent the last 12 years of my life, and we'll probably spend the next 4, and then we'll probably go to like grad school, whatever. I think would just be pretty healthy for me to just try something new and see something different.
Leo goes to high school in a suburb outside of New York City, where he says there are sky-high expectations to get into top-tier universities and succeed in your career.
I mean, sort of a pressure cooker environment. I think probably sending 7 kids to Ivy League schools this year. And everyone else is sort of just as competitive. And yeah, I mean, I think I've gotten a pretty good, solid, well-rounded education there, as well as you can expect from like a public school that doesn't really start to specialize in anything.
Right. And so when you talk about it being a little bit of a pressure cooker, or that feeling that, everyone is kind of pointed towards the same thing, like, what's that energy like?
From freshman year, basically what you're thinking about is like, I need to do well in high school so I can get into a good college. And that's just the path everybody takes. Like,
right.
The vast majority of vast majority of students go straight to college from high school. And that's just sort of what we think of as the natural progression of things.
Yeah.
You're a smart kid from a wealthy town, you do well in school, you go to a good college, and things turn out all right.
Right. Can you remember times when you felt like, or places where you felt like that idea was either introduced or heavily influenced by people around you?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly my parents have something to do with it. Both of them one went to an Ivy League school, the other went to Stanford. So both of them sort of have this aspiration for me.
How do people respond to the idea of a gap year? Like, how do your parents feel about that?
Well, it's funny. I think my parents are actually very, very pro gap year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty young for my grade. I'm a July birthday. And so my mom has read up on all this research saying that students who take a gap year have better outcomes in college because they've had maybe a year to mature before they are sort of required to fulfill that high executive function demand that college will require. I think she thinks that it would be pretty good for me to take that year to develop. And I think my dad is probably on board with the same, but I'm not sure so many of my classmates would be as down.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the other question I have is like, do you feel like there are other fears that you hold around your academic and maybe even career future, personal future, like fears about not being happy? It sounds like you feel like you're on a path to like get a good job, sort of like the same stuff that everyone wants. Do you feel anxiety or fear about like, am I making the right decisions with my life? Am I doing the stuff that actually will bring me happiness? Or is that not something that you worry about right now?
It's definitely something I'm thinking a lot about. I mean, so more academically, I guess I sort of have this fear that I will, for the rest of my life, just keep putting off everything, keep procrastinating every essay and every homework assignment. And then there's a deadline at your job and that's procrastinated and oops, maybe you get fired, et cetera, et cetera.
Are you a procrastinator in general?
Definitely.
Yeah, I can relate very deeply to that. All right. No more procrastinating, bringing Abby in. Abby, I'm sure so much of this is probably familiar to you. What's your first response hearing Leo's story?
Leo, I feel with you. I feel for you. I remember being you. I went to a very academic high school, grew up in Oakland, California, and had checked the boxes, heads down, gathered the gold stars. I got into Stanford and felt like, oh my God, I've won this game that I didn't even realize I'd been set up to be playing. And there was something in me that felt this sinking sense of hollowness. This feeling that I'd been playing somebody else's game, that I'd been good at what I was doing, but I had no idea why I was going through those paces. And I remember distinctly feeling like, wow, why is everybody encouraging me to just keep going, heads down?
This is our expert this week, Abby Falik. She's a social entrepreneur who helped launch The Flight School, an organization dedicated to helping students navigate the transition from the end of high school to whatever comes next. And as Abby explains, for a lot of people, it may make sense to jump off the traditional education treadmill and consider other ways to learn outside of the system.
Look at the data that 1/3 of college freshmen don't come back for a second year. And I think it's fair to say that's like just wasted time, talent, energy, and money. And on average, kids take 6 years to get through 4-year institutions. So there's a lot of money flowing to an education that's not yet deliberate or on purpose. So for me, it's not a question of can we afford to add this extra year? It's actually, can we afford not to?
So today, we're going to press pause and take a moment to wonder, how do we get a real education out of our education? How do we find the right pace for ourselves? And how should we think of a gap year, even if we don't come from a family with money? Stay with us.
Reboot your credit card with Apple Card, the only credit card designed for iPhone. It gives you up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase. Plus, Apple Card has no fees, not even hidden ones. Apply for Apple Card now in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA Salt Lake City branch, subject to credit approval. Variable APRs for Apple Card range from 19.24% to 29.49% based on creditworthiness. Rates as of February 1st, 2024. Terms and more at applecard.com.
Speaking of finances, summer is one of the best times for a family trip. Maybe you're spending time camping in the woods, or you're lounging on the beach, or maybe you're jetting off to a glamorous destination in order to discover a new culture. That's actually what I'm doing in a couple of weeks. Me and my kids, we're going to Europe for the first time. No matter where you're going to need a budget and at least a little extra money on hand. So here's how to save for that trip in a way that feels a little bit easier. Lots of us spend without intention, and it's this unintentional spending that often drains our accounts more than we think. So put a little intentionality behind your shopping. Figure out what you need to spend each month and what you want to spend each month. And remember, you don't have to forego all the niceties. You still want to live a little bit. But for everything else, stop and evaluate. Do I really need this right now? Tell yourself if you're still thinking about it in 24 hours, in 48 hours, a week from now, however long you decide, then you can guilt-free go back and get it. Techniques like this, which help us visualize delayed gratification, which means not giving up that gratification, but just visualizing it in the future, helps us control our impulses and make smarter purchasing decisions. And that's what leaves you with the extra money you need to make this family trip the thing that you have been looking forward to all year.
This episode is brought to you by Choiceology, an original podcast from Charles Schwab. I'm Dr. Katie Milkman, a behavioral scientist and professor at the Wharton School, and the author of the best-selling book, How to Change. You may have heard expressions like, time to get up and going, today's bad decisions aren't going to make themselves, or bad decisions make good stories. But really, no one wants to suffer the consequences of making a bad choice. Join me as I share true stories from sports heroes, Nobel laureates, and everyday people faced with monumental decisions. We'll discuss the latest research in behavioral science and dive into themes like whether we can learn to make smarter decisions and how powerful it can be to get a do-over. And we'll share useful tools and strategies to help you make better choices in your own life. You can find Choiceology at schwab.com/podcast or wherever you listen.
We're back with high school senior Leo and gap year expert Abby Falik, who says there are a number of reasons people balk at the idea of stepping off of the education conveyor belt.
Everything in our culture is hooked on speed, right? It's the sort of underlying capitalist engine, and there's just a sense of scarcity of it's somehow a race and you got to get there fast or the jobs might run out. So I think it's about speed. I think we've all got this sense of FOMO, a fear of missing out or of getting behind. I think historically parents have been concerned that their kids might get, quote, off track. But my experience now, 20 years into this mission, is recognizing that parents, including me, should be more concerned about our kids getting off track if we keep them on the track in many ways. That the learning that matters most can't happen in a classroom. And by preventing kids from having opportunities to learn about themselves and how they want to learn, what lights them up, what gets you out of bed when there's no alarm clock, and what do you learn when there's no syllabus, that those become the power skills. So, another huge consideration for most is financial and the expectation that somehow taking this year will cost somebody a lot of money. When in reality, there are so many ways to have a transformative experience in that transition that don't cost anything. I think part of my work has been, how do we change perceptions around what this year is and can be? And so it starts, in my view, by actually getting rid of the terminology around a gap year. So if you think about the words we use, a gap is a hole. It implies that you're falling into a hole that you might not come out of, like who wants to send their kid into the gap? But it also suggests that this is like the gap or the space or the absence of learning. And in my experience, if you design this year deliberately, it can be the set of experiences that fill in the gaps that were left by the rest of your traditional schooling. So my take here is, if we can reorient around, what if this were a launch year? The experience that sets you up to make the most of the rest of your higher education, whatever form that takes. There are many ways that this becomes such a powerful return on investment when we're thinking in financial terms.
Looks like we already have our first two insights from Abby. Number one, it doesn't make sense to think of a gap year as a gap year. The point of it isn't the absence of something like school, but rather the gaining of something like experience, perspective, information about how the world works and how you work in the world. And another, maybe even deeper insight is that we don't have to think of education as a race to get as much as we can as quickly as we can. It's not a game show. It's an opportunity to develop and grow at the pace that makes the most sense for you. Abby learned this firsthand.
I ended up going straight to college because I couldn't find the right type of experience in that sort of liminal space that we're now calling a launch year. But I spent a year in Latin America. So I spent 2 years on campus and then 1 year on my own in Latin America, not enrolled in any program or study abroad. I was working with local projects. And I came back and felt suddenly like I had clarity, I had focus, I had a sense of confidence. I knew why I was there. I also petitioned for my year of experience to count for credit. And I look back and that also just feels like an important data point for me because I already had this intuition that the things we can learn outside of the classroom are just as worthy of credit or credentialing as the things you learn in a lecture hall and then spit out on the exam. And I think that's even more true today. The way we're doing school hasn't changed in generations, and the world has never changed this fast, but it also will never change this slowly again. But I think there was a clear moment of reckoning when we all, in the last 12 months have watched AI pass the SAT and the MCAT and the LSAT, right? So as soon as the robots are now passing all the exams and all of our education is still oriented around those exams, shame on us if we're not stepping back to say, okay, now what is the purpose of school in this world where the robots can already outcompete us on the intellectual academic stuff? So I think that's playing a big role in contributing to a sense that just a skepticism around the traditional pathways and a willingness to look up and start to rethink them.
Well, that does make me wonder, Leo, about how you learn when you're not assigned something. Like, what have you learned how to do and taught yourself or gone out to get taught that wasn't because someone assigned it to you, but because you wanted to know?
Yeah, so I guess the summer before my junior year of high school, I was planning on going on some trip in Alaska. Get to Alaska, I have an allergic reaction there. Come home, I get COVID. It's a whole disaster. But basically, I'm holed up at home for like 2 weeks. No one to talk to. I was like, I have nothing to do. I have nothing to entertain myself. And I have a calculus class next year. I might as well. And I have a calculus textbook there and a calculus textbook there. And I might as well get started. I might as well get a head start, keep my junior year light. And then I sort of made my way, like, most of the way through the book in maybe a week, 2 weeks. Like, it very quickly moved past the point where it's like, this is what I need to be doing because I need to be on top of things. And, like, this is genuinely cool and stimulating. And solving problems is fun and exciting.
I love being able to notice, Leo, when learning feels awesome. And I love how that lights you up. I just flashed on a history teacher I had in high school where literally she sat reading from this very ancient earmarked notebook. She would just read page after page after page. And we were expected to take notes on what she was reading. And then essentially the exam would be cutting and pasting the notes we'd taken. And it was just such a poignant example of one of the most famous education theorists and philosophers, a Brazilian named Paulo Freire, had a way of describing the banking model of education, this idea that the student is there to be deposited into, that something gets put into your head and then regurgitated out through society and the system. And I'm just so encouraged by the opportunity to unhitch academic learning from schooling in a way that could free us up to totally rethink what we mean by learning, what we mean by an education, and to do it on purpose, which is what we really need.
Just like what then would your ideal history class look like or math class if in this world where we've sort of abandoned the depositing information to students view of education.
I'd love to reimagine teachers as guides. I spent last year, actually, I pulled my 2 kids out of school and we spent a year exploring learning models around the world, just as part of my lifelong passion for understanding what it looks like to leave our comfort zones and sort of reorient our perspective. And we enrolled them in school in 6 different countries
Wow.
as a way of seeing other ways of learning, teaching, and knowing. And to see contexts that put kids and their individuality at the center, or that honored their agency. They went to a school in Spain that was like a free school model where the teachers were called guides. There was no set curriculum and the kids moved in a pack across ages. They were ages like 5 to 15 from one room of the house to the next. And one had carpentry and one had music and one was for cooking. But it was just this reorientation around, if we can let them follow their curiosity, something magical can emerge.
Okay, that sounds awesome, but obviously it's not feasible for most of us to pull our kids out of school and educate them in Spain. So what then? Still, as Abby points out, it's not only helpful to rethink how we approach education and learning, it might be absolutely necessary. It's high time. Robots can pass tests. Curriculum can be found anywhere. Gone are the days where learning is just about paying to access information and getting a rubber stamp. It's now time to think of learning as an interactive way of growing who you are and how you understand the world. And that doesn't have to happen in a school setting at all. And another thing I'm hearing here is an updating of the old idea that if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. I'm not sure if that's true, but I do think that it's more important than ever to pay attention to what, as Abby says, gets you out of bed without an alarm clock. That can absolutely guide you into a life where you are truly offering something to the world and are excited by that, rather than just a life where you are just trying to get gold stars from everyone so you can prove your worth. I want to ask Leo, if you do take a gap year, what kinds of learning do you think you would like to pursue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite broad, but I mean, I think I just want to sort of learn about how to be in the world in a way that I haven't that I haven't really been required to do, because there's just so much structure and so much rigidity to the way I've gone through school and the way I will for another 4 years probably, that it's just like, what do you do when you're not in school? What does fulfilling work feel like?
I can't not jump here. I mean, I've showed my cards already. I'm obviously the most biased person you could possibly be talking to. But Leo, that's the question. What does fulfilling work feel like? Imagine if you could spend a year exploring that. Imagine how far ahead of any of your peers who've not sat with that question and played with what it feels like in the world. And I can also say that you would get to college and not approach it in the way that you approached high school, because you would have a deeper felt sense of the learning that enlivens you, the kinds of teachers that you seek out when they're not the ones who are assigned to you, the kind of work that ultimately is going to feel enriching and fulfilling. And then what role does college play in that equation for you? It sounds very likely you're going to end up in college, but you have the possibility of approaching it in the driver's seat, in like chasing down the things that you're most hungry to learn and feeling the freedom of not being on someone else's map or someone else's track, right?
I think a lot of the way I've thought of college is, or a lot of the way I've sort of seen it spoken about is just a rubber stamp. It's not so much about what you learn there as the proof that you can get through it. So I guess, how might we replace that rubber stamp?
Yeah, what do we give credentials for? And I think that's changing fast too. So there's a trend among all the big name brand employers that a college degree is no longer a requirement, because they actually recognize it doesn't necessarily signal all that much about what you've learned how to do. It signals that you got in and you persisted, and it may signal some things.
And you say somewhere in some of your research shows that something like 11% of employers believe that college graduates are ready to enter the workforce when they graduate, as opposed to some 97% of college administrators who believe that.
Yeah. And then similarly, I found this fascinating. There was the head of the college board wrote an op-ed in The Atlantic and cited research that showed that 3% of kids who complete college, just 3% report having had a transformative experience. And when you think about the opportunity of that life stage to set your values and your identity and your compass, we've not talked a lot about it, but part of my research and fascination has been with rites of passage around the world and cultures and religions that have honored this transition between childhood and adulthood and dependence and independence with a rite of passage, with a structured way of moving from one stage of life into the next. And we just miss it in some rush to get to somewhere, some elusive, race to nowhere. But there's a different and better way, in my view, to use that moment when you've got the maturity to leave home. And what if we could send you out into the world with the right amount of structure, with support to frame and define your questions, with teachers and coaches and mentors to sort of be with you, to have a cohort and community of peers, but all of that to scaffold self-directed learning, Leo, to take a couple of jobs that help you explore that question of what feels fulfilling, but to not do it alone, to do it somehow in community. So that's the model I'm most excited about right now.
I would push back a little bit on the idea that we don't have rites of passage. I think like all the talk about the college experience is basically some distilled version of how can we make college the most important rite of passage it can be. I think that's why people are so concerned about fit. They want, in theory, to get as much out of their college experience as they can.
What I'd add there is sort of traditionally or historically, a rite of passage includes leaving your comfort zone in a pretty significant way and finding yourself really disoriented, being in a context that feels foreign to you. And that doesn't need to be halfway around the world in a foreign country. That can be in a different zip code. But there's sort of a framework in learning around where we learn the things that are most sticky. And there's academic learning in a classroom context, but there's sort of this spectrum I think about where we all have a comfort zone, a stretch zone, and a panic zone. And my experience, having worked with thousands of kids in this life stage and age group, is that the really rich learning happens in that stretch. And in my experience, it can be harder to have that experience on a college campus, which is going to feel similar in many ways to high school. Different in some, no question, but still the same basic structures around you and a similar population of students, probably.
Yeah. Okay.
It can feel so tricky to choose the right path for yourself. For Leo, it's a matter of stepping away from the discourse and expectations of the rigid school system he grew up in. But is it enough of a change for him to pursue liberal arts in the fall? Or would a launch year, as Abby encourages, be a more enriching experience? When we come back, we'll dig into Leo's quandary a little bit deeper. Also, what if you are thinking about taking a year off, but feel nervous about the financial implications? Stick around.
Reboot your credit card with Apple Card, the only credit card designed for iPhone. It gives you up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase. Plus, Apple Card has no fees, not even hidden ones. Apply for Apple Card now in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA Salt Lake City branch, subject to credit approval. Variable APRs for Apple Card range from 19.24% to 29.49% based on creditworthiness. Rates as of February 1st, 2024. Terms and more at applecard.com.
This episode is brought to you by Defender. For those who embrace the impossible, the Defender 110 is up for the adventure. This iconic vehicle has been redefined with thoroughly modern design. The exterior is reimagined with compelling proportions and precise detailing, and the interior is built with robust materials and integrity. The Defender capability is legendary, whether you're facing off-road challenges or harsh weather conditions. Built for the modern explorer, the Defender 110 lets you go further and do more. And cargo capacity means more room for your gear. To drive the Defender is to explore with greater confidence. Powerful innovations like the intuitive driver display and award-winning infotainment system keep you connected. Innovative camera technologies deliver unobstructed views and effortless maneuvering. Ready for a wide range of adventures, the Defender family features the two-door Defender 90, the Defender 110, and the Defender 130, which seats up to 8. A vehicle made to go further. The Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender. This episode is brought to you by Defender. For those who embrace the impossible, the Defender 110 is up for the adventure. This iconic vehicle has been redefined with thoroughly modern design. The exterior is reimagined with compelling proportions and precise detailing, and the interior is built with robust materials and integrity. The Defender capability is legendary, whether you're facing off-road challenges or harsh weather conditions. Built for the modern explorer, the Defender 110 lets you go further and do more. And cargo capacity means more room for your gear. To drive the Defender is to explore with greater confidence. Powerful innovations like the intuitive driver display and award-winning infotainment system keep you connected. Innovative camera technologies deliver unobstructed views and effortless maneuvering. Ready for a wide range of adventures, the Defender family features the two-door Defender 90, the Defender 110, and the Defender 130, which seats up to 8. A vehicle made to go further. The Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender. We're back, talking with Leo and expert Abby Falik to figure out where Leo might want to go after high school. You may have noticed, like I did, that right before the break, Leo did something that is unusual for many of our listeners, especially those in high school. He pushed back. He heard something that he didn't agree with, and he was not reluctant to communicate that. I've been thinking a lot about that part of the conversation. It seems to me that Leo feels fairly confident advocating for himself in the world, and that's a good thing. Maybe that's a function of his personality, but I have a feeling it might also have something to do with where and how he grew up. And having that sort of innate confidence might come from going to a well-funded school, being immersed in a nurturing environment, having Ivy League parents. Many of us who don't have those things often don't feel secure enough to make our own decisions about what to do with our lives. We feel like we have to be good citizens, not rock the boat too much if we want access to financial resources and to support ourselves and our families. So this can make all this talk about finding your passion and stepping off the conveyor belt feel a little silly or dangerous even. But Abby seems to feel that this is also a mindset that we need to shake loose from.
I have a very deep conviction that finding your purpose is not a privilege, and it's not at the top of Maslow's hierarchy. It's actually at the bottom. It's step one in knowing who you are and what you're here for and navigating wisely and building skills and perspectives that are going to serve you well in a world that's changing so fast. But the other piece of this, for me, is my fear that the story we're telling about college for all, college is your chance and your opportunity, it may have been true for a period of time, but I don't actually think it is anymore. And again, it may very well be the best and right and only next step for certain kids. So I'm not here to say it doesn't make sense for anyone, but I am deeply concerned that if all you've focused on is passing the tests, getting in, going through the motions, and getting a degree in something, moving toward a job that very likely will not exist, I am scared that you haven't taken advantage of the other opportunities to learn other skills.
You know, there's so many questions about how to do a gap year, right? Like, what does one do to make the most of it? And Abby, I know this is really what you've done over these years, is thought about how to intentionally and specifically take a gap year that does in fact function like a launch year and not like a hole or a sort of period of learning loss. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through a little bit, what are some key things we need to know if we were to somehow be able to magically design our gap year from the ground up? What would you want us to keep in mind?
I've been working on a framework that I think is universally applicable, and it doesn't cost any money. So the framework is this, and it starts where you did, Leo, which is define your questions. Figure out what's hot for you. What are you naturally curious about? And I sometimes think about this as coming up with questions in two categories. There are the very internal questions of like, who am I when I'm outside of my comfort zone? Or what really makes me happy? So those are sort of the internal questions. And then there's questions about the world. Like, why does inequality show up in the way that it does? What's leading to this kind of polarization in my community? It's defining those questions, and then it's committing not to answering them quickly. And then the questions may change over time, but you're not actually in a hurry to answer them.
Here's another insight. If you are taking a gap year, define some key questions that you're genuinely curious about. Figuring out early on what most sparks your interest can help shape your year.
The next is figuring out who your teachers are. Who or what, right? They may be experiences, they may be people, they might be halfway around the world. But who or what can help you learn what you're looking to learn? And I think these people also don't have to be teachers in a formal or technical sense. I think it's about tuning into the people in your life who really see you or who've been where you want to go. So, define your questions, find your teachers, and then it's leaving home, leaving your comfort zone. And as I said before, this doesn't have to be a fancy, expensive, halfway around the world experience. This is about finding yourself in a context that feels foreign, that forces you to reevaluate who you are, what you value, to see your identity more clearly. And in this leaving your comfort zone, ideally you're getting proximate to something that really lights you up or breaks your heart. So if I zoomed out, the whole thing could be summarized as pause, orient, begin again.
If you were to zoom back in, what would maybe a more concrete example of that look like? What's an example of a gap year or a launch year that you've seen as particularly successful?
So here's the secret. What you do with the year doesn't end up mattering nearly as much as how you approach it and how committed you are to sitting with your questions and getting the most out of the experience. And I say that because I don't know enough about your interests or your curiosities to say whether the best experience is going to be through, a combination of this job and that internship and then maybe some travel. But what I can say is that knowing what you're trying to learn and then designing around that and having folks who will help hold you accountable is the best way to really help this year cohere and count.
So I've already committed to a school. I'm going to St. John's College in Santa Fe, it's a liberal arts school that sort of functions off like what they call a great books program. 500 kids, everyone reads the same things at the same time. And there's not a whole lot in the way of like hardcore math. So that was definitely a big choice. And I think the way I justified it was that I think 4 years of that sort of education would provide me with just a more interesting outlook on things.
I'm also wondering if you feel any anxiety or like potential FOMO in missing out on the freshman year of college if all of your peers are off having their first year experiences and talking about them in the chat and you're not. Do you worry about feeling that kind of like missing out feeling?
Honestly, I think to me, one of my bigger hesitations is that I actually know quite a few of the kids who are going to be in the freshman class. It's a small school, 500 kids, but I know a few of them from a program over the summer. And so part of my hesitation is that it would be exciting to just spend another 4 years with them, as opposed to if I take a gap year and I'm sort of offset from them for the rest of my college experience.
The FOMO is real. I mean, I felt the FOMO before we knew to call it FOMO, but you don't need to have the whole thing planned. And so that would just be another thought to carry is, I know there's an instinct to want to have the whole thing dialed, but leaving space for it to unfold is actually part of the learning, is like being able to sit with the ambiguity of not yet knowing. And so often when I've worked with young people, they've sort of mapped the first 3 months. And then the next steps have emerged from that with people they met or an interest they wanted to follow. So again, it's a little scarier, but it's also a little bit more like how life works. So just one thing to think about.
No, I really like that approach. Definitely daunting to figure out how you're going to spend a year. And I think also that's part of the reason why the language like gap year or even launch year can feel so intimidating, because it's like, what are you going to do with your year?
Yeah, that's right.
How is it going to replace your
Yeah.
year of college? As opposed to like, if it's something that happens to you, you are just out in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that observation, and I think that's right. And it is that thing where it's like you're trying to change the paradigm, and these paradigms are so deeply set within the way we view the world. So if you think about, I finished my 12 years of school and now I'm going to go to my 4 years of college before I do my 2 years of graduate. You're always thinking of things in these kind of like discrete years of accomplishment. And so the gap year then feels like a year of accomplishment that you just do it outside of school, but you're still like accomplishing. You're still like trying to squeeze everything into this year and make sure that you pass your gap year.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when we do it carefully, it can help us shift what we even mean by passing or what success looks like. I think that's one of the things that keeps me so motivated is watching how ingrained our definitions and narrow our definitions of success are, just fed to us by society. It's in the water we're in. And to have the opportunity to say, oh, I can actually define success on my own terms. And what does it look like to be ambitious about the things that I care most about, not just what others have expected of me? And that's true for kids who've grown up in privilege. And, you know, I just crave it being true for all kids. What would I do if I weren't afraid?
What do you think, Leo? Forgive me if this is too much, but I'm inclined to point that question toward you. Like, what would you do if you weren't afraid?
I mean, to be honest, I think the school I've chosen is about as far from being afraid as I can get, for the most part.
Yeah.
Because I sort of rejected that I like a sort of a traditional liberal arts model for a very out there, niche, small school.
Yeah.
My parents definitely had their hesitations, still have their hesitations. To them, it's sort of hard to conceive of.
Right. That you had the opportunity to go and basically get the endorsement of these names, these name brand schools, and that you chose to do something because of what you're interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, funny enough, they call their teachers tutors rather than professors, as sort of like your guide theory, rather than professors who get up and profess their knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
Like as you were talking, everything you were saying sort of resonated with what I've been hoping to get out of this school. There's a lot of freedom to just like read on your own, and I think I'll have plenty of time and plenty of people with similar interests or opposing interests that might be equally as exciting.
Yeah. I will say that one thing I've noticed about my kids at 21 and 18 and their friends and all the young people that I come in contact with through those relationships is that when we are young, we are under the impression that we have to figure something out immediately or else perish.
Yeah.
And one of the great differences I find now that I'm 50 and looking back is that, actually that sense of urgency about figuring many things out was actually misplaced. There is plenty of time to figure things out, to figure out certain specifics and kind of technicalities of what I'm doing. And actually, the more I understand who I am and what I believe in, the easier it is to figure out what I'm doing, and the easier it is to wait, to sit in the question, as Abby said, the easier it is to sit in the question and then let answers come to me that are the right ones, as opposed to just making a decision, even though I don't really have an answer because I'm worried that not knowing will get me in trouble. So there's plenty of time, is what I'm saying, even though it never seems like there is.
There's plenty of time and plenty of ways, different modes. I mean, you can carry these questions into your freshman year. And that might, for you, be the right context for sitting in them.
Yeah, definitely.
And you can then make a different choice at some point. It sounds like both Carvell and I took our time midway through. So may you be fortunate in having a long life with many opportunities.
Thank you.
Yeah, love it. The main thing here is that it can be hard in the midst of all these systems, all this momentum, all this fear and pressure to make everything work. It can be hard to feel like your life is actually your own, that it truly and deeply belongs to you, and that you get to decide what to do with it. And the more you sit with that, the wilder and more revolutionary an idea it is, especially under capitalism. But Abby has come here to tell us that not only is it possible, it might very well be absolutely essential. Because in the end, besides your life, what else do you really have? Thank you to Leo for sharing his journey with us, and good luck with wherever you find yourself. Let us know how it goes. And thank you to Abby Falik for all of her insights. We'll share a link to her website in the show notes. Now, listeners, have any of you ever taken a gap year? How did it go? Was it worth it? Send us a note at howto@slate.com or leave us a voicemail at 646-495-4001. That's where you can also send us any other burning questions that you need answers or at least some friendly advice for. Again, that's howto@slate.com. And if you like what you heard today, go tell just one person to check out our show. That helps us help more people. How To is produced by Rosemary Belson and Kevin Bendis. Joel Meyer is senior editor and Derek John is executive producer. Merritt Jacob is senior technical director and composed our theme music. Charles Duhigg created the show. Courtney Martin is my co-host, and I'm Carvell Wallace. Thanks for listening.